Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. I wanted to speak with Quentin Stafford-Fraser because he was involved in the first webcam. And I say web in quotes because it wasn't technically on the web, but, well, you'll understand the distinction when you listen to the episode. But Dr. Stafford-Fraser has been involved in so many things, right up to the present day, that I couldn't help but ask him about the rest of his fascinating career. So, in this episode, come for the webcam history, but stay to hear about studying computer science under the founding legends of the field, launching the first web server at Cambridge, the development of virtual network computing, augmented reality, and even the present and future of smart and autonomous car technology. I think this really is one of the best oral histories that we've been privileged to capture so far, so I know you're going to enjoy this episode with Quentin Stafford-Fraser. Quentin Stafford-Fraser, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's an honor to be here. I love the podcast.
This is going to seem sort of a pedestrian first question, but I feel like it's kind of apropos for what we'll be talking about. I would have to imagine that maybe you were interested in computers at a young age, and or do you remember when you realized that computers were what you wanted to devote your professional life to?
Yes, I was very interested at a young age. In fact, I can remember the very first computer I ever used, and by that I mean actually got my hands on, which was in the Science Museum in London. They had a mainframe there which ran 2 or 3 very, very simple programs, but you could actually get your hands on a keyboard and use a real computer. And I don't know what age I must have been then, but yes, ever since then, I have been very interested in computers, and I think I count myself as very lucky. I think people of my kind of generation, a little bit older and a little bit younger, have almost seen the whole of, not quite the whole of computing history, but stuff, back from the days when we had to solder together transistors to make computers, up to, writing apps for iPads. And I count myself very fortunate to have kind of gone right through that spectrum, whereas I imagine younger people probably, so much is handed to you on a plate that obviously that has advantages as well. But no, it's been fun to learn it almost kind of from the ground up.
Well, and you have had the benefit of learning it at Cambridge, which many people will know is one of the world-renowned places for computing research, computing science, going back to almost the very beginning of computing science. And so when you go to university, you study computer science at Cambridge, right?
Yes, that's right. At least I started with a year of general engineering, because computing at that point wasn't even a full 3-year course. So you had to do a year of something else beforehand. So I did engineering, and then I moved to computer science. And there were many things I loved about that change, and one of them was that computing was still, relatively speaking, a young topic in the university, and a lot of the people who had been very important key pioneers in computing were still walking the corridors and giving lectures. So I had lectures from people like Maurice Wilks, who was the guy behind EDSAC and EDSAC2, which we here would claim was the first real useful computer. It was a general purpose computer, and it could store its own programs electronically, and it actually provided a real service to the university, rather than just being something in a research lab. So people in Manchester and Princeton and other places would claim that they had the first real computer, but we like to think that Cambridge at least has a good claim on this. And Maurice Wilks was the guy who ran that project. I made friends with David Wheeler, who, amongst many other things, is credited in having the first ever PhD in computer science, and with inventing the subroutine. Right? This is something so fundamental. It's like going to college and studying physics and finding you're having a cup of tea with Isaac Newton. I mean, it was really good stuff. And Martin Richards lectured me. He was behind the BCPL language, which very few people ever heard of, but nowadays. But out of BCPL came a language called B, and out of that came a language called C, which many people have heard of. So. But more recently, and particular interest for me was that Cambridge was the place where Clive Sinclair was based, who made the very first computer I ever owned, and people like Andy Hopper and Herman Hauser, who built Acorn computers. Now, Acorn is not so well known outside the UK, but it was the company that made the BBC Micro, which was essentially, I think, transformative for the UK's digital IT industry, because it was a wonderful computer designed for teaching, and it was comparable in time and power, I suppose, to the Commodore VIC-20, that kind of period. But it was a more capable machine and designed very much for education, and most of us kind of cut our teeth on that thing. And Acorn computers led on to what was originally the Acorn RISC machine, and then became known as the ARM processor. So the ARM processor also is, very much a Cambridge creation. So yes, for me, Cambridge was a wonderful place to come because it had so much history. But back at that point, a lot of it was still fairly recent history.
For your undergraduate work, what are some of the things that you're researching and some of the things you're interested in?
Well, my undergraduate work was fairly basic computer science, but just after I finished it, I got a job with my college in Cambridge. So the university here is split into lots of colleges, which are kind of like dorms on steroids for American listeners. So my first real job after my undergrad was looking after all of the college's computers, which wasn't very many in those days, but it was still a fairly large number. We had something like 100 computers in our college, which was unusual at that time, and almost all of them were not networked. And so I was looking after these machines that were essentially being used by most people as glorified typewriters, and were running, DOS version 1 and Word version 1 and things like that. But there were some people doing some more interesting things with them, and one of the fellows of the college, a chap named Anthony Edwards, was very interested in Venn diagrams. John Venn had been a fellow of the college in his own right, considerably earlier, and everyone knows the Venn diagrams, the sort of three overlapping circles that you get to show whether things are a member of one or more sets or some combination of them. But often people don't stop and think, what would you do if you wanted to show more than three sets? It's actually quite hard to come up with a shape that you can draw on a bit of paper that gives you four overlapping sets where you've got all of the different combinations of possible set membership. So if you think of it in digital terms, a circle on a Venn diagram represents a bit, and so three sets gives you 3 bits. There are 8 different areas that can be represented by those bits. So what do you do if you actually want to have more than 3 sets? And Venn himself kind of thought about this quite a bit. But Anthony Edwards came up with a way of doing it, which is a little difficult to describe on an audio podcast, but you can look up online and see an Edwards Venn diagram. And I was in his office one day, and he was showing me his bit of, I think, Pascal code that was printing these Venn diagrams out on his, it would have been a dot matrix printer at the time. And so he could draw a sort of 5 or even 6 set Venn diagram. Now, I thought this was quite fun, but I had just taken delivery of a laser printer, which I think was only about the second or third one that the college had. And of course, this had much more resolution than the than the dot matrix. So I thought, maybe I could produce a higher resolution Venn diagram with more sets. So I went back to my office and I started thinking about this, and I quickly hit a problem because the printer had, I don't know, maybe 300 dots per inch or something. And I wanted to construct an image of this multi-set Venn diagram. And I realized that my PC, which probably had 512 or 640K of memory, didn't have enough memory to hold the image of the page that I wanted to create.
Right.
So either I had to do some really clever stuff to work out, to kind of create bits of that image on the fly and just send a few lines at a time to the printer, or I was going to be stuck. And then I realized that the printer itself must have enough memory to store the image of a whole page. It had more memory than my PC did. And it was also a PostScript printer, which meant it was a fairly expensive one in those days. And so I wrote a little program in PostScript, which was a fairly short file, where you could basically change one parameter in the PostScript file saying how many sets you wanted and just send this text file to your printer. And it went and sat and thought for a very long time and then churned out a printer. And I could print, 7 or 8 set Venn diagrams with this. And but I knew somebody who worked on the Cambridge Science Park, or a friend of a friend, who worked in a company that had I want to say linotype Lintronics printer, which I think was, even back then, maybe 1,000 DPI, something like that. And so I sent him my PostScript file. And a little while later, he sent me an acetate. I wish I still had it. I think it crumbled into dust. But I believe it was the world's first 10-set Venn diagram that was actually printed in any kind of physical form. So that was one of my little hobbies back then.
You're working around this time. You joined the systems group. Is that what we've already described, or is that something that comes?
Yes, no, that's right. I moved on from essentially doing PC support in my college to the University Computer Lab, where I had studies as an undergraduate, and I was a research assistant there in a group. It was a project called the Fair Isle Project, which, if I remember rightly, was funded by HP, and we were looking at multimedia networks. Now, back in those days, we had Ethernet networks, but Ethernet wasn't Cat5 cabling like it is now. Right. Ethernet was 10 megabit, and it was coax cables that you ran around the room, and little T-pieces would come off and plug into the back of each computer. And you could do a lot of things with this, but you certainly couldn't do broadcast quality sort of TV-type video. And so we were looking in this group into how you might do that. What would you actually need in terms of network architectures to be able to do broadcast quality video? And one of the things that hadn't really solidified then was which networking standard was going to win for local area networks. Ethernet had been fairly successful at the 10 megabit level, but there was also Token Ring at the time, which was quite popular. And there were also ATM networks. That's nothing to do with cache machines. That's asynchronous transfer mode networks. And they're a bit different because the way you make connections on an ATM network is you basically set up a connection from where you are to where you want the packets to end up, all the way through the network, and then you can get guaranteed bandwidth on that link. So it's really, really good for doing multimedia stuff. It has some other failings.
So is it both circuit switching and packet switching, or is...
it's essentially circuit switching. Okay. You set up the circuits in advance, and it's still used in many situations as the backhaul for mobile phone networks and things. But it never, in the end, became very popular on the desktop. But back then, we were just starting to get 100 megabit Ethernet, and we had 25 megabit ATM networks, and they would give you comparable multimedia performance, comparable general bandwidth, and probably the ATM would give you rather better multimedia performance. And certainly as we were stepping it up to kind of 150 megabits, the ATM networks were definitely superior. In the end, other forces, took over, and Ethernet was what became popular on the desktop. But that's the stuff we were looking at. So we had lots of equipment that did simple multimedia stuff, including some video cameras, which back then were, expensive toys, and not many people had them. And we had some frame capture cards, which would let us connect those video cameras to our dedicated single board computers in a rack that we had created for testing out these ATM networks. And so we had various fun toys. We could do multimedia stuff in this lab. Another thing that was happening at about this time was Linux was just starting to be popular. So, actually, not really popular back then. It was still just getting off the ground. I remember I had a PC I could run Linux on because I think it was a 720 kilobyte floppy disk. And that's what you really needed to get Linux going. But you couldn't really run X Windows on it. That needed 2 floppy drives or ideally a hard disk, and I had never had something as valuable as a machine with a hard disk.
And this is what, 1990, 1991?
This is 1999, 91, yes, and at least I'd never had one that that had that luxury that I could just play with, for some hobby project like this, new Linux operating system. But I was also intrigued by the idea that I could conceivably own a Unix-based machine, which beforehand had only been something you hoped to get access to on the university network. And the idea that you could run it on something you could actually own was quite exciting. And there was a spare PC in the lab in this room on which I could, which someone had finished using for some other project. So I cannibalized it and I put Linux on it, and that was part of my love affair with Linux, which has gone on ever since. But we were all working there in this room that we had a habit of naming rooms and computers and projects in those days after kind of classical mythological names and characters. So this was the Trojan room, and there were a group of about 10 of us, I think, working in there. I was a humble research assistant. There were some people doing PhDs, and they were all mostly doing stuff to do with either these low-level networking protocols or particularly how you ship multimedia over computer networks. So that's kind of what I worked on first of all there.
Well, this is the perfect time to go into the story of the Trojan Room coffee cam. So, as you say, you're in the Trojan Room, and there's multiple levels in the building you're working in, and there happens to be one coffee pot that is 1 or 2 flights away from you, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, now I have to set the record straight. I have been misrepresented in the media sometimes here because actually I sat right next to the coffee machine. We had this really terrible coffee machine, but it was all we had, and so we felt that a freely available supply of caffeine was very important for computer science research, and actually it wasn't freely available. We had to pay for it, but it was still pretty awful. It was just a coffee drip filter machine. But we only had one, which we shared between all the members of this group, who, were 10 or 15 of us by this point, and some of us were in the Trojan Room, and so we're right close to the coffee pot. But some of people were, maybe on another floor, up a staircase, round the corner, and so they tended not to know when fresh coffee had been made, and so. So those of us who were close by definitely had an unfair advantage here. And trust me, the coffee wasn't very good even when it was fresh. But if it had been sitting on the hot plate for a while, it was really awful. So one day, a friend and I, Paul Jardetsky and I, looked at some of the bits of multimedia kit that we had left over from a recent project. And we thought, we ought to be able to do something about this for the benefit of our fellow man. You see, this was very much a philanthropic project. And so we got a little camera which we could connect to one of our single board computers. And I think I gripped the camera in a retort stand or something and pointed it at the coffee pot. And Paul wrote some software that ran on this little single board computer, which was using our network stacks. It wasn't over TCP/IP in those days. It was using our remote procedure call system. It certainly wasn't using anything like HTTP because the web hadn't come along yet. And but what it did do was make available the image of this coffee pot on our local network. And that was something that you could then see if you ran a little bit of software that I wrote, which would basically put an icon-sized image of the coffee pot in the corner of your screen. So as long as you were running our networking stack and on our local network and running my bit of software on your desktop, you could then, as you were working, just glance down and see this picture of the coffee pot and decide on your coffee consumption strategy, based on whether it looked as if it was full or empty or filling up or perhaps going down. It was only updated maybe every 20 seconds or
right.
so.
Right. We should say that this isn't live video as you would think of it today. It's grabbing a still image every couple seconds or whatever interval. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, that was part of the charm of it. Everybody else in this group was working flat out to see whether you could really get, TV quality, that standard definition TV quality over a network in glorious color, and could you get the colors just right and so on. And here, Paul and I did this thing which had an image that was probably 120 pixels square or something like that, and grayscale, and about 3 frames a minute, but it was still actually really useful for giving you a bit of information that you didn't currently otherwise have. And that kind of got me interested, which we can come back to later, in this idea that cameras don't have to be pointing at people to be useful. Most people were thinking about, wow, if we had cameras connected to a computer network, we could do video conferencing and things like that. And I thought, yes, that's great, that's interesting, but what else can you do? What can you point cameras at to help you understand better the world around you?
Or just deliver data.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So there was no other easy way really to wire up that coffee pot, and we happened to have a camera, and so we pointed it at this thing. Now, as I say, it was, back in those days, it required my special bit of software to be able to view the image, but it turned out actually to be one of the more useful things I did while working for that group, because everybody in the group ran this program so that they could keep an eye on the coffee pot. And about the time I was finishing in that group and moving on to work on my PhD, this thing called the World Wide Web started. Now, actually, the World Wide Web was just beginning about the time we did this, but early web browsers didn't display images. They only displayed text. You could have a couple of different sizes of text. I think you could change the color of your text, but they didn't show any images. They were very much a hypertext system. And
do you mind if I could interrupt you real quick? Because I want to do an aside here. There's lots of accounts written about the web being developed and the various steps of its development. I'm actually curious because I don't know that I've read a lot about web adoption from the other side. So you're at Cambridge and you start to hear about it. Can you tell me just a little bit about like hearing about the web as a project, as a new technology, at Cambridge? In your role as computer scientist.
Yeah, well, I heard about it because when I was doing my PhD, I was funded by Xerox. Now, Xerox had a little lab here, which was an offshoot of their Palo Alto lab, Park. This we called it Europark at the time, and we had very close connections with the Palo Alto lab, and so we tended to hear news from the Valley fairly early on. And I remember one of my friends calling me into his office one day to show me this bit of software that someone had sent him from Palo Alto, which was called Mosaic, and it was this web browser thing, and I had heard something about the web, but it was still brand new then. And this was back in the day when there were probably, let's think, when I saw it, I'm guessing there were maybe 4 or 5 web servers online in total. Right? That was it. So you didn't need bookmarking or favorite systems in your web browser because you could remember all of the addresses of any website you might want to go to, and they were all linked up pretty much anyway. So that was about the state of it. But the thing that for me made the web really interesting was it was a very quick way to get a nice user interface for something, whatever that source of information may be. And it was really easy to plug all sorts of different sources of information into the back end. Writing a very basic web server is very straightforward. You can do it in a few lines of code. So
what you're saying, sorry to interrupt again, is what to someone that's an early adopter, the thing that really excites you about the web is its extensibility. Like there's so many different things that you can do with it.
That's right. It looked nicer. I mean, the display of the Mosaic browser was already fairly nice looking. You know, text was not generally rendered in a very beautiful way on Unix workstations of the time anyway. And so anything that made it look even vaguely pleasing was a good starting point. And on this, you could take something that, you know, just put out fairly raw data and make it look nice, make it accessible remotely to people. And so you could take whatever experiment you were doing at the time and plug the data into this World Wide Web system, and then maybe write some documentation about it and point your friends at it, and they could get at it even if they weren't running your applications or sitting next to you or whatever. They might be somewhere more distant. So that was one thing that excited me about it. The other thing is that over the next year or two, I found that the National Science Foundation, which ran a lot of the US internet backbone at that time, would publish their statistics on some of the key backbone links for how much data was being used by various different types of traffic. Because, of course, the internet carried email, it carried FTP traffic, it carried NNTP news,
Waves,
it carried all sorts of stuff in those days. Gopher was just, coming. But I remember looking at this new HTTP protocol, and it was something like, I think when I first started looking at it, it was about 120th in the ranking or something like that. And so I started capturing these statistics. I wrote a little script which would capture these statistics once a month and would plot a graph of what was using the most bandwidth. And I could see this HTTP thing screaming up through the ranks. It was like some, horse that's at the back of a race that, everyone thinks is never going to get anywhere. And it was clearly going to be a front runner really soon. And the idea started to dawn that this could even get bigger than something like FTP. That was amazing at the time, or email. And so, it was at position 120, and then the next month I looked at it and it was at position 80, and the next month I looked at it and it was at position 65 or whatever. And you could see that in a fairly short number of months, it was becoming one of the top 10 users of the internet, and that was just amazing. So, at first, we didn't know whether this particular thing that we'd seen in the form of the Mosaic browser was going to take off, or whether it was just another fun curiosity out of a research lab somewhere. But you could tell from this trend that obviously we weren't the only ones finding it interesting. And so I started to look at it more seriously and take various things I was doing and start making them available in web form.
Well, right. And as you say, it was relatively easy to do something like set up a web server. So I believe you're involved in setting up the first web server at Cambridge.
Well, I think so. I haven't had anyone contradict me on this yet. I was spending some of my time in Xerox and some of my time in the university, and I certainly ran one on my workstation in the university. And I don't believe anybody else in the university, or certainly not in the computing lab, who would probably have been the first, was running one at the time. Now, back then, there wasn't this convention that your web server would be called www or something. So my workstation had the memorable name of, I think it was pelican.cl.cam.ac.uk, right? Which you would never find. Of course, we didn't have search engines or anything then. But if you happened to know that particular URL, you could point a web browser at it and you could see some stuff that I had put up there. I don't even remember very much what it was at the time. But one or two students were starting to hear about this web project thing, and no one in the university ran an official web server that they could put stuff on at that time. So they would point people at me and say, oh, I think Quentin's got one of those running on his workstation. Go and see if he'll let you put your script on there as well. So I think I possibly ran the first web server in Cambridge, and certainly I think the first one in the university. And more and more people started to want to do things with this, with this new technology, and so it was clear to me that this was going to be big.
So just because I want to finish up with the sort of the story of the coffee pot camera. At some point, you guys get the bright idea to take the coffee pot camera and put it on the web, and so then it's not beholden just to your network that you guys are running right there.
That's right. Yes. So in I think it was early 1993. The first version, Mark Andreessen proposed this idea that there could be an image tag in HTML, so you could have images in your web pages as well as just text. And in early 93, there was a version of Mosaic that could actually support images. And so people started changing their web pages to include the logo of their organization or a picture of their girlfriend or a graph of their results or something like that. And we had this idea which is really, really, really obvious now, but was novel at the time, which was when a web browser asks for a particular image, it goes to a particular URL and the web server gives it the image back, usually a file from the file system. But suppose the web server gave it back a different image each time. What would happen? Would the browser cope with this? We didn't know. So we thought, where have we got a source of constantly changing images? Okay, the webcam. It wasn't a webcam then. The coffee pot camera. And so a couple of friends of mine, Martin Johnson and Dan Gordon, basically took the output of the coffee pot camera and essentially enabled it to produce HTTP. And so you could then embed this image in a web page, and when you went to that web page, you could maybe get an image of the coffee pot full, or possibly half full, or possibly empty, and you didn't know. It was really exciting stuff. This seems crazy now, but at the time there wasn't very much new on the web, and the idea that some people would take a really valuable and unusual thing like a computer with a camera connected to it, and devote that to the problem of seeing how much coffee was in their $30 coffee pot was kind of a sufficiently wacky idea that it got people's attention.
Well, and also, though, because now it's on the web, I could, if I were in California, exactly, I could see if a coffee pot is full or not in Cambridge in the UK.
Exactly, that's right. You had essentially a live image of somewhere else in the world from wherever you were, and this was something that normal people didn't get to see, really, except through broadcast television and things like that. And so even if it was a crazy thing to look at, you could do this. And so people would call us up and ask us to, put our hand or put something in front of the camera so that they could see whether it really did change. And one of the first things we discovered was that we needed to point a light at it, because we got people complaining that they went to look at this thing and it was just a black image, and that was because they hadn't realized it was the middle of the night over here. And so, we were suddenly dealing with cross time zone computing as well. And so it had a little angle poised light pointed at it. And yes, as a side effect of putting this on the web, people didn't need to run our special networking stack and my special bit of software. And so it meant anyone in the building could view how much coffee was in the coffee pot, but it also meant anybody in the world could view how much coffee was in our coffee pot. And this kind of crazy idea caught people's imagination, I think. And so it got a lot of media attention. And it went on getting media attention for quite a while, because we used to joke back then about internet years being like dog years. Everything happens 7 times as fast on the internet, kind of thing. And so something which was a novelty then went to being a historic artifact in a very small number of years. So first of all, journalists would call me up and say, what's this new coffee pot camera thing? And then they would call me up and say, can you tell me about where webcams started? And then they would, call me up because it would become a historic artifact, and this was all in a period of a small number of years, and only on the internet could something happen at that kind of speed. I remember the biggest news, of course, came after about 10 years when the University Computer Lab was moving to a new building in another part of Cambridge. And the one thing that had always been kind of consistent about the Trojan room coffee pot, as we called it, was that it had always been in the Trojan room, and the Trojan room wasn't going to exist anymore. And so also the kit it was running on was really getting quite old by that point, and we didn't really use these networking protocols anymore. And there were all sorts of reasons why it was becoming a little bit harder to maintain. We'd gone through quite a few coffee pots as well by that point. And so we made this decision to close it down. I would have had about 10 years. You could say that 10 years in internet time was a lifetime in real time. So that was it seemed sensible that we should close it down when there was no longer a Trojan room. And of course, this generated a whole big new media storm, because all of a sudden this thing that was an icon of the early web, the early web having been about 8 years ago, was going to be turned off. And at that point, everybody was trying to get attention for their business and the fact that their business now had a website. And we were saying, we've done that website thing, we're going to turn it off. And at one point, there was 1 week in which I was quoted on the front page of the London Times and the Washington Post, which, for talking about this little coffee. I will never do. This is kind of publicity people will kill for, and right. I probably will never do anything else in my lifetime that A, was so trivial, and B, got so much coverage. But there you go.
Yeah.
So
actually, I'll ask you about that again at the end. But let's come back to the chronology of your career. So the Coffee Pot Cam was launched around the time that you are working on your PhD, I believe. And can you tell me about what your PhD thesis was? The project working on Brightboard and
Brightboard,
things like that.
Yeah. Well, Brightboard, the Coffee Pot camera had taught me, as I say, that there was interesting stuff you could do by pointing cameras at things other than people. And so I started thinking about what else you might do if we ever got to the stage where cameras were actually affordable enough that you could use them as general purpose input devices, right, rather than something that you might have specially installed in a video conferencing room. And we were just starting to get to the point where cameras could be made on a single chip. And I realized that if you could do that, rather than requiring, I think they would have, 3 CCD chips before that, one for red, green, and blue, and they were expensive and so on. But if you could make them on a single chip and put a fairly cheap lens in front of it, they would have no moving parts. And there was this outrageous idea, that they might one day even be cheaper than keyboards and mice, which, of course, they have become now. And so I thought, suppose we had lots and lots of cameras, and maybe even every computer had one, rather than just our one computer in the computer lab. What might you be able to do with them? And so part of the inspiration for my PhD was trying to get computers to understand a little bit more of the world around them. I think it was Nicholas Negroponte about this time I heard saying that he wished his computer had as much intelligence as the urinals in airports, because they knew when you were standing in front of them, where your computer didn't. Right? It couldn't even tell that. And so the idea was born that you could at that time you could start to create kind of GUI programs using things like HyperCard, where even school kids could create simple apps that would say, do this if you click your mouse in this corner of the screen. And my idea was, could you make something that would say, do this if there's movement in this corner of the room? And, could we get to such a simple use of video processing? So that was the underlying idea I was working towards. But my particular implementation of this was a thing I called Brightboard, which involved pointing a camera at a whiteboard and trying to understand a little bit of what was going on the whiteboard. Back in those days, you could get electronic whiteboards, but they were usually big sort of wardrobe-sized boxes that were back projected, had special pens that could be picked up by some sort of sensor inside the box, and they cost thousands of dollars and so on. And my idea was that if you pointed a camera at a whiteboard, you could still use it as a completely ordinary whiteboard. So everybody would know how to use it. There's no special course you had to go on how to learn how to use your electronic whiteboard, you could just walk up to the whiteboard and use it. But if you made certain marks on the board, it might do something for you. So in my case, if you wrote the letter P and drew a little square around it and then stepped out of the way, the computer would grab an image of the board and say, aha, I can see a print command, and it would print out a copy of the board for you. And it could do various other things. You could use different symbols to stop and start video recordings, or to turn the lights up or down, or change the temperature of the air conditioning, or whatever, simply by writing on the whiteboard. So your user interface to the computer was just the whiteboard, and you didn't have to go near the computer. Any feedback was audio feedback. So if you did your little character P in a box, it would say printing, and that would tell you it had seen it. And if you did a P and a 2 in a box, it would say printing 2 copies. And so it was this idea, what we now call, kind of augmented environments. And I was doing it through video, and partly because of what I'd discovered on the coffee pot, that you can do fun things if you point cameras at things other than just people.
Well, and as a coincidence, my parents are both still elementary school teachers here in the States, and
right.
While it's not a direct line, that sort of technology is starting to take over elementary classrooms, at least here in the States. It's not universal yet, but that's the technology today.
I think it's interesting. I have a bit of a bugbear about this because we know that drawing is very, very important, right? We started off by drawing cave paintings on the walls of caves. Every office you go into, at least any interesting office, has whiteboards on the wall. Classrooms all have blackboards and then whiteboards at the front of them. And one thing that technology really hasn't done very well for us yet is drawing, particularly drawing as a communications medium. So here we are, we're sitting in front of our two computers on opposite sides of the Atlantic, and I can send you files, and I can have video conversations with you, and I can copy and paste URLs and so on. But if I actually wanted to draw a picture now, a little sketch on the back of an envelope that I might, it would actually be quite difficult to get that to you, because essentially computing hardware has developed around the mouse rather than around the pen. And we're starting to get to the point where the value of drawing is beginning to be recognized. But I think the value of live drawing transmitted over a distance, accompanied by speech, is somewhere we still got a long way to go on really taking advantage of that.
So after attaining your PhD, can you tell me about the work that you do at the Olivetti and Oracle Research Lab? Yeah,
so Olivetti had an interesting lab in Cambridge at the time, run by Andy Hopper, who I mentioned earlier, and we worked on a variety of different things there. The lab was also partly funded by other people at different times. So when I first started, it was the Olivetti Research Lab. It then became the Olivetti and Oracle Research Lab, and in the end, it became one of AT&T's research labs. And one of the big things we were looking at was network computing. So I don't know if you remember, but back then people were talking about network computers, the idea that you could maybe make a computer which, was really just a web browser, and which, of course, you get now with some of the Chrome OS stuff. But back then, this idea that could you actually do everything you wanted on a web browser, or maybe a web browser that had some Java, and so various
Sun was really on board with this.
Sun did one of these, yes. So Oracle was very interested as well, and so people were making hardware that was designed essentially to be a network-only device. It didn't do anything without being connected to the network. And one of the things we were working on at the time was what became VNC. Many people may know the VNC protocol. VNC is essentially, it stands for Virtual Network Computing. And it's usually used as a way of letting you view the desktop of another computer from where you are. So nowadays, people have probably seen things like GoToMeeting, GoToMyPC, screen sharing on Skype, all of these kind of things. But back then, the ability to view another screen from a remote place was fairly new and still a kind of really interesting idea. And So we had this idea that you would leave your computer running and you would travel around the world and you would use some thin client, in our case, a thin client bit of software, to get back to the screen you had left running. So you didn't need to carry everything with you. You'd just check into your hotel room, and the network computer there would let you connect back to your desktop at home, so you didn't have to carry a big, expensive, fragile computer around with you. And the protocol that we created, and I was only a small part of this. This is mostly my friend Tristan Richardson who gets most of the credit for this. Was a protocol called VNC, which stood for Virtual Network Computing. And there were a couple of interesting things about that. One of them was that it was an open source project. And that was something that was fairly new for the lab at the time, but we decided that we would make this project essentially available to anybody who wanted it. And so VNC actually became really quite big and quite important, and a lot of people use it now, not knowing that it's the VNC protocol that's underneath it. And often, if you are connecting to a screen of a machine that's not the one you're sitting in front of, it's quite often actually VNC underneath it. And my friends who worked on that went and set up the real VNC company, which is now the one that basically manages that standard.
Mm-hmm. And this notion of thin clients is something that sort of runs as a thread through work that you do for all of your career, really. Like you tell me about this idea of like ultra thin clients and developing IT solutions for the developing world.
Yes. Well, what happened sadly in 2002, what was then the AT&T lab that we worked for was closed down. Everybody was closing all sorts of things down after the dot-com boom, and so my friends and I were all thrown out on the street, and we all had to go and find other things to do. And it was actually a very good thing for Cambridge as a whole, because many, many companies around Cambridge came out of the people who had worked at that lab and employ an awful lot of people around Cambridge now. But I met up at this time with a guy named Martin King, who was based in Seattle. And Martin had done very well out of inventing, you may remember the T9 predictive text system that you used to use on old cell phones, right, so that you didn't have to, type press the 5 button 3 times to get the letter N or whatever it was. It would use a dictionary to try and work out what words you were typing. And Martin had developed the technology and the company behind this, and had got some good patents on it, and had managed to sell the whole thing to AOL at just the right time. So he had some resources. He was looking for a new project. So was I. When the lab closed down, he got in touch with us, and because basically he wanted to hire the entire VNC team. But the other guys had already got this idea that they were going to go and do something with VNC on their own. But I ended up getting on very well with Martin, and we started to talk about other things we might do with this concept of sending graphics over networks very fast. And what Martin wanted to try was essentially, how fast could you make something like VNC? Imagine that you've got a screen image and you are sending it over a network. Could you do it so fast that you couldn't actually tell that you were on a network? So it would be the same as a VGA lead or HDMI lead from the point of view of the user experience. Right. And we worked out that actually you could, though you had to make special hardware to do this, because at the time anyway, the problem with a protocol like VNC, which was designed to run on general purpose computers, was that it went through all the layers of the software and networking stack, and that kind of slowed it down a bit. Even if the network between the two ends was very, very fast, it was quite hard to make it a completely transparent experience. But we did some maths on the back of an envelope, and we worked out that actually, in theory, even on a 100 megabit Ethernet network, which was what we had by then, you ought to be able to get to the point where, for most normal use, you couldn't actually tell that the screen you were sitting in front of was connected to the computer by a general purpose network, rather than, say, a VGA lead. And so we thought, what could you do with this? Well, one of the things was that Linux, which I mentioned earlier, was starting to become much more popular and viable on the desktop. And Linux was a multi-user operating system in a way that at the time Windows and the Mac and so on weren't. And so what you could maybe do is take the power of Moore's law, which meant that my computer now was many times, maybe 8 times faster than my computer of just a few years ago, and you could maybe allow 8 users to use that computer without having to buy 8 computers. Now, this is important for various reasons. It's one of the things that interested us was the environmental impact of computers. So my way of illustrating this at the time was that we learned it took 1/4 of a ton of fossil fuels to build a PC. Now, if you take a number like that and you multiply it by the number of PCs that were shipping each year,
hundreds of millions,
yeah, you get this huge number, which is really hard to visualize. So my visual aid for this was I imagined, suppose you got a whole load of cars going from New York to LA, all the way across the states, nose to tail on the highway. They're all stationary. That's about 1 million cars if they're Ford Tauruses. That's how I worked it out at the time. Okay, so that's about 1 million cars to go across the states. Now imagine they're filling up 4 lanes of the highway. So you've got about 4 million cars. And none of them are moving because all of their tanks are empty. So you go all the way across America, filling up from empty to full every single one of those 4 million cars. That was about how much fossil fuels we were using to build PCs every day. And though in the global scheme of things, PC production didn't rate high on the fossil fuel use, scale, it was still quite a significant amount. So there was, could we make a more environmentally friendly way of doing computing? But there was also, could we make a more affordable way of doing computing? Because computers then would typically cost $500 or $600, but most of the world, certainly half the world, was living on around $1 a day, and so that means that a computer would cost you more than a year's income, maybe 18 months' income. And if you think now about your income over a year and imagine that that's what your next computer would cost you, that really puts a different spin on how many you can give to your kids and how easily you can put them in classrooms. And so this whole idea of providing internet access, IT access in general to the developing world, we thought maybe if we can take a multi-user operating system like Linux and some way of creating desktop images and sending them over networks to a very cheap device which could display the pixels, then you could plug maybe 8 users into a single PC for substantially less than the cost of 8 PCs. So that was the start of this project, which we called Ndio. Ndio is a Swahili word. It means yes in Swahili, and there's a whole long story behind why we chose that as well. But so that was this not-for-profit that we started, which was trying to make IT more affordable, more sustainable, more accessible to people, basically by using some of the pixels over networks technology. My life seems to revolve around sending graphics over networks.
Right.
So it was like a very, very lightweight VNC protocol and some very, very dumb but very, very fast hardware, essentially a single chip that could receive the pixels over the network, slam them on the screen, doing as little as possible in between. And it was a great project, and we did installations in internet cafes, in schools, in far-flung places around the world, and that was Ndio. Out of it came a commercial organization, because Martin essentially funded this for a while on the understanding that some commercial thing would come out of it eventually. And indeed, what did come out of it was a technology for sending pixels at high speed, not over Ethernet networks as we were doing it, but primarily over things like USB. And that became a company called DisplayLink, which makes products that essentially let you get USB hubs and other types of accessory technology for various different types of mobile and desktop devices, and let you attach it let you do the graphics for the screens over networks like USB. and so that kind of grew out of the Indio work. But yeah, that was great fun, and it was interesting to see both the sort of not-for-profit charitable side of the technology, but also doing the whole VC-based startup kind of thing, which was what DisplayLink became.
Right, the technology that becomes commercializable.
That becomes it, yeah.
Right.
You can buy it today embedded in many monitors. If your monitor lets you plug into your laptop via, it'll let you plug in via HDMI and via VGA. But if it lets you plug in via USB, then that's probably because it's got a DisplayLink chip in it, and that has the big advantage that you can then plug as many monitors as you like into your laptop, rather than just however many sockets there happen to be in the for video connectors.
Well, if I haven't taken up too much of your time, I'm curious what you've been up to in the last few years and what you find interesting. I mean, you've been involved in so many different interesting aspects of technology over the years. What are you working on now, and what do you find interesting coming down the pike in the future?
Yeah, so I have two hats that I wear at the moment. Most of the week, I have a little software company called Telemark, which develops essentially Internet of, I suppose we'd call it Internet of Things technologies now, though we didn't really know that phrase when we began it. Mostly it's to do with digital signage. So it's screens on walls in public places, in hospitals, in doctors' surgeries, and things like that. But very much, again, using web-based technologies and network technologies. So this idea of graphics over the network still hasn't kind of left me. So I do that most of the week. But then one day a week, I'm back in Cambridge University, and I'm wearing a sort of at least a pseudo-academic hat. And I'm even back in the same group I used to be in a quarter of a century ago when I was doing my PhD. And what we're looking at there is it's a project called Endeavour, and Endeavour stands for, roughly, Enhancing the Driver Experience Through Vision Research. So this is a project that's largely funded by Jaguar Land Rover, and it's the group in the university has a lot of traditional strengths in vision, in machine learning, in those kind of related technologies, in analyzing the emotions of people. So you point a camera at someone and try and work out whether they're happy or sad or bored or excited or whatever. And what we wanted to do with this project was look at not so much the whole self-driving car concept, though I think that's fascinating, and I could talk for a whole separate hour about self-driving cars. But as we are at the moment, how can we use some of these technologies to improve the experience that a driver has when driving a car? So the kind of things we're looking at are, if I'm driving down the road and I'm using a sat-nav, the sat-nav will say, turn left in 100 meters or 100 yards. Whereas if you're sitting beside me and we're driving down the road and you're giving me directions, you'll probably say, turn left just after the traffic lights, or turn right over there where that yellow car is coming out. And those are very different types of instructions. And so we're looking at, can we use vision and other technologies to make sat-navs, for example, give instructions more like humans would give them, which are perhaps easier for human drivers to parse and understand. How not all of us are very good at knowing when 150 meters has gone by, but you can see the yellow car down there. So that's one part of it. Other things we're looking at are if your car or your phone or your sat-nav or your media system wants to tell you something at the moment while you're driving along, they usually just do so at the time they know they've got something to tell you. So you may be trying to negotiate a difficult junction, coming onto the highway, there's a big truck coming down beside you, you're looking over your shoulder, and your car goes ping to tell you that you need a service in the next 1,000 miles or something like that. That's really not the time you need to get that bit of information, right? There are some bits of information that are important that might be safety related or navigation related or whatever. And there are some which really aren't, like, your mother has just tweeted about you. It's not something you need to know when you're in a safety critical situation. So we've been looking at prioritizing all of the different messages that your car and your in-car systems may want to tell you, and then working out the times at which you are safely distractible, so that we can get the benefit of some of these new technologies that are coming on board without making life very dangerous. So
it's a combination of sort of predictive technology, but also situational awareness.
That's
that
right.
Sort of thing.
And looking at how you're using the car, looking at whether we've got cameras pointing at the drivers. Can we see when you're looking over your shoulder? Can we see when you look bored? Can we see when you're clearly not looking at the road, or when you are looking at the road? There must be all sorts of ways that we can enhance the driver experience using these kind of technologies.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because with all the talk of driverless car technology that you read about lately, it's all about the cameras looking out, and that's interesting. That I hadn't thought of that before, about the cameras looking in to aid the driver.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we're doing some stuff with cameras looking out as well, but I think that there's going to be an intermediate stage. We're starting to get to the point of driverless cars, and frankly, I can't wait. I'm just longing to get, as soon as I can get a car that will drive itself that I can afford, I will be doing so. But if you turn those cameras inwards and look at what the users are doing, is the passenger talking to you at the moment, and it may work the other way as well, as not just reducing distractions, but if you're actually on a very long straight highway and you've been doing it for half an hour and you're getting bored and sleepy and so on, maybe it's actually useful if the car gives you some information to keep you awake. You are now passing the Church of St. Andrew, which was built in 1540 or whatever. It could actually be important for maintaining your alertness and awareness, as well as kind of reducing the stress of driving as well. So that's kind of fun. But I'm very interested in what's happening in the whole world of cars and transport at the moment. One of the things I keep telling people I'm longing for is not so much a self-driving car, but a self-driving motorhome or RV. So as I love this idea, I just love this idea, especially here, right, where we've got the Channel Tunnel. It'll take us to Europe. So I can imagine not very long from now, I'll pick up my iPhone on a Thursday night and I will summon my my motorhome from out of town, and it'll turn up, and I'll get in with my wife and my dog and a good movie and a nice bottle of wine, and I'll say, Chamonix, please, or Venice or whatever, and then we'll watch a movie and we'll go to sleep and we'll wake up in the Alps or in Venice or somewhere like that, and we'll walk the dog and we'll have a nice weekend, and then it'll drive us home again. And if you don't want to have a big motorhome, when you get to the Alps, because it's an awkward thing to drive around, you just tell your regular car to follow you.
Well, and that's interesting too, because if you extend that notion out, you could imagine a future where maybe people don't have really fixed locations, fixed residences, because you could always take up and go with everything you need and go wherever you wanted. You
can, and you can do that on the large scale, right? You can have some big mobile office home thing that, can take you from place A to place B while you're working. But you can also imagine, what does it do to, for example, how far people are willing to commute, where you're willing to live in the world. If your job's in downtown Manhattan, where would you could live much further away, perhaps, if you could have breakfast while you're driving there, right? Or you could be catching up on your sleep on your commute, in a way that obviously you can do if you've got really good public transport, but that doesn't really work for everybody. So I think that's going to be transformative. I've just got a new toy myself, which is an electric car, which I'm loving, and it'll do a little bit of this. It will do not as much as, say, some of the Google cars are doing, or even Teslas are doing at the moment, but it will, under certain circumstances, when you're moving slowly, it will follow the car in front if you're in heavy traffic. It certainly has this adaptive cruise control, so that you can, you set the cruise control, but if you get too close to the car in front, it starts to slow down and things like that. And that's all done through vision. That's all done through a cheap camera, basically. It doesn't even have radar on my car. It's just a camera that looks out through the windscreen. And it's amazing to me now that how far we've come from the days when, it was outrageous to point a camera at a coffee pot because, the camera and the computer that was controlling it cost so many times the cost of the coffee pot that we were pointing at. Whereas now, my car has at least 2 cameras in it, and that's when they're still only looking out. They're not looking at the driver and the passenger. So I think it's very exciting. It's great to see how the world of images and both transmitted over networks and the world of image processing and image understanding has changed in the relatively small number of years, I like to think, since I, kind of first got my hands on a camera connected to a computer.
Yeah, it's so interesting how that thread has gone all the way through your career. And actually, maybe that's a good way to end this talk, because let's come back to that notion that you first learn these lessons by pointing a camera at a coffee pot. You said, kind of joking a bit that, maybe nothing that you've done in your career will get as much attention as that dumb coffee pot. Do you get annoyed when every couple years people like me call you up and ask to talk about that?
Oh, no, I love it. To be honest, I feel a little guilty because some of the other people involved in this haven't had as much publicity, either because they're more camera shy than I am, or they're in other parts of the world or whatever. But yes, I've been dining out on this for years. I get invited to do television interviews and so on quite a lot whenever they want to do something about the early days of the web, and they can't get hold of Tim Berners-Lee. Then they want somebody with a British accent. They often call me up, and it's. So it's been a fun experience, and it goes on being a fun experience. And I think you could draw, sometimes with, I don't know whether with much justification, but I do try and draw bigger lessons from this about the reason that the web was such a success and continues to be such a success. Is nicely encapsulated in that coffee pot idea, right? Because we didn't have to ask anybody's permission at all to take a bit of data that we had, make it available to the world in a form that anybody in the world could see. We did it in one afternoon, pretty much, and it became, a kind of internet hit. And that captures so much of what the web's about. It made the stuff more accessible. It didn't require much work at the back end, and we had no idea we were going to do it. We had no idea it was going to become big. And the design of the web, the simplicity of HTML, the simplicity of HTTP, the open protocols, and so on, the fact that it was never controlled by a corporation or based on commercial software, all of these things enabled the coffee pot to happen as a small kind of humorous example of essentially the bigger web picture, why the web worked, why the web took off when a whole load of other systems, which had many of its characteristics, were just never quite so successful.
Well, and if you'll indulge me, I mean, again, I think I called it just a dumb coffee pot, but you hit on something that I think is the key thing when you were describing it at the beginning. It's data, like, because it's almost binary data. Like you're telling people coffee pot is full, coffee pot is not full.
Yeah.
And so when we think of where we're going, when they talk about things like the Internet of Things and all this stuff that's supposedly coming down the pike, it is about data, and it's about maybe going to a world where it's impossible not to know anything. Like the analogy that I always use with people that is sort of kind of similar to the coffee pot idea is like, there's a specific bench in Paris where I asked my wife to marry me, and right now there could be someone sitting on it. Right now there could be snow on it. Right now, I don't know, but that data, we now have the ability to know that information. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's right.
In the same way that knowing if a coffee pot is full or not across the other side of the world, that's sort of what everything seems to be moving towards.
That's right. And what's trivial for some people is important for others, right? Anyone else looking at that bench in Paris may have no idea that it's so special to you. And so it's really hard to predict what's going to be important for individuals, what's going to be important for certain groups. For us, it was about regular and easy and fair access to caffeine. For other people, it's about, nostalgia and remembering memories. Someone came up, My friend John Norton has written a very good book about the early days. It's called A Brief History of the Future.
I have it.
Yeah, and that's a great book for the early years of the internet and some of the people who are involved. But he at a talk recently described the internet as I think the talk was entitled something like Vint Cerf's amazing surprise generating machine. Right, and I think that is a big part of the internet. The fact that its design means that no one could predict what was going to be done with it. Right? If you had built a system which was only good for video conferencing, for example, then we would probably have amazing video conferencing now. But would we have had all of the other things that we get? And the brilliance about the internet and then the web, of course, that built on top of that was that it made so few specifications about what could or couldn't be done with it, and that it really is a surprise generating machine. It's like sometimes on these TV interviews and so on, people ask me, so what's your prediction for the next 15, 20 years? And I basically say that if you could predict it, then it wouldn't be the web, right? If you could predict it, it wouldn't be the internet, because the whole nature of the internet has been to allow us to do things that we could never have predicted in a way that perhaps almost no other technology has ever done.
Well, Quentin Stafford-Fraser, thank you so much for using your career as sort of like, a framework for all of these things that we've been talking about on this podcast and that we're trying to explore that have happened over the last 20 years and now beyond.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's been great fun, and I shall go on following the podcast with enthusiasm. There's lots of great episodes on there I still have to catch up with, and I'm sure there'll be lots of great ones in the future. So thank you very much.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.